All right, today's podcast, we're going to be covering the second part of a series covering Poor Charlie's Almanack. So my last podcast covered the first two talks, and today we're going to cover some of the learnings from the rest of them in the book. So we're going to start with some Q&A section that Charlie has at the end of talk 3, where there's some students asking them some great questions. And the one question I want to highlight first is where a student asks Charlie about how does he foster a culture where people are comfortable talking about mistakes they've made and course correcting. So here we go. The student asks, how have you created an atmosphere comfortable enough for people to abandon that tendency and admit that they've made a mistake? For example, someone here earlier this year from Intel talked about problems that occurred with their Pentium chip. One of the most difficult things for them to do was to realize they'd been going about it the wrong way and turn course. And it's very difficult to do that in a complex structure. He's talking about how big of a company Intel is. How do you foster that? And I love Charlie's answer here. Here he goes. He says, Intel and its ilk create a coherent culture where teams solve difficult problems on the cutting edge of science. That's radically different from Berkshire Hathaway. Berkshire is a holding company. We've decentralized all the power, except for natural headquarters style capital allocation. So I love that answer. I mean, the first thing I noticed here is the word decentralized. He says, we've decentralized all power, right? That's something I've heard Jocko talk about a lot. It's his fourth law of combat, decentralized command. You want things to be decentralized. I was looking at that same book I referenced last time that has a lot of Buffett and Munger quotes in it, titled, All I Want to Do Is Know Where I'm Going to Die So that I Never Go There. I'll be quoting that book a lot today, by the way, just because it has so much great content and quotes and thoughts from Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett. But in that book, one of the things Munger says is Berkshire's system of decentralization is the most efficient kind of organization you can possibly have. Right. So this is kind of the first part of his answer. So student asks him, hey, how do you create a culture where people are comfortable admitting that they made a mistake and course correcting? He says the first thing we do is we decentralize all the power. It's the most efficient kind of organization that you can have. And he emphasizes that a lot. Back to his answer. By and large, we've chosen people we admire enormously to have the power beneath us. It's easy for us to get along with them on average because we love and admire them. And they create a culture for whatever invention or reality recognition is going on in their business. And included in that reality recognition is the recognition that previous conclusions were incorrect. All right, so he answers the first part of this question by saying, hey, you got to make sure the power is decentralized and people have the ability to make those decisions. And then the second thing we're going to do with that, how do you accomplish that decentralized structure? We choose people that we admire enormously to have the power beneath us. We love and admire them. And so that's a constant theme that I've gotten from reading this book, from listening to David Sinra's podcast, the Founders podcast, where he talks about Charlie, is they are huge on trusting people. They hire people with proven track records that they trust. Going back to pulling some of the quotes from the other book, some of the things they say on trusting people and how they go about choosing the people they work with. Buffett, we don't try to change people. It doesn't work well. We accept people the way they are. And then Munger says, the failure rate at trying to change a culture is likely to be 100%. Back to Buffett, changing cultures is really tough. I've had little experience with that. The trick in business is to get in with a culture that's already the right kind. We want people joining us who are already the type that face reality and that not only tell us the truth, but tell themselves the truth, which is even more important. Once you get an organization that lies to itself, and there's plenty out there that do, I just think you get into all sorts of problems. And people know it throughout the organization, and they adopt the norms of what they think is happening up above them. So, like I said, I loved this question. It really stuck out to me. It was one of those that I reread 2 or 3 times and had a bunch of spots that I underlined. Like I said, just summarizing it, student asked, hey, how do you create a culture where people are okay with making mistakes, and talking about those and making shifts based on them, or making shifts based on the new information that they have coming in. Number 1, create a decentralized organization. And number 2, everything's built on trust, admiring enormously the people that they have below them. And when they dive into talking about trust, making sure that they know that they're not going to be able to change people, right? And these guys have had so much experience. They've seen so many different businesses. And here they are telling us like, hey, we don't try to do that. We've tried a bunch. We have a failure rate of 100% of trying to get people to change. You want to get people in that you trust and that they're going to look at reality the way it is. And that's how you create a decentralized organization. So I loved that question in the way Charlie answered it. Second question, this is skipping forward a little bit in the book. One of the students asked, and a little bit of important context here. He's speaking to a group of law students. I forget the university, but it's a bunch of students that are about to graduate and go into the profession of law. So the question from the student, it says, you mentioned that only a select few investment managers actually add value. So Charlie was talking about investment managers in his talk. Since you're speaking to an audience of future lawyers, what would you encourage us to do in order to be able to add value in our profession? I love that question. So here we go. Charlie says, to the extent that you become a person who thinks correctly, you can add great value. To the extent you've learned it so well that you have enough confidence to intervene where it takes a little courage, you can add great value. And to the extent that you can prevent or stop some asininity that would otherwise destroy your firm, your client, or something that you care about, you can add great value. There are constructive tricks you can use. For example, one reason my old classmate, Joe Flom, has been such a successful lawyer is that he's very good at dreaming up little vivid examples that serve to pound the point home in a way that really works. The ability to do that is a knack. And here we go. Now he's going to give us an example of how we can do this, what he's talking about. He says, for instance, suppose you've got a client who wants to commit tax fraud. If he doesn't push the tax law way beyond the line, he can't stand it. He can't shave in the morning if he thinks there's been any cheating he could get by with that he hasn't done. And now he's talking as a student. You can approach this situation in either of two ways. You can say, I just won't work for him and duck it. Or you can say, well, the circumstances of my life require that I work for him and that what I'm doing for him doesn't involve my cheating. Therefore, I'll do it. And if you see he wants to do something really stupid, it probably won't work to tell him, what you're doing is bad. I have better morals than you. That offends him. You're young. He's old. Therefore, instead of being persuaded, he's more likely to react with, who in the hell are you to establish the moral code of the whole world? But instead, you can say to him, you can't do that without 3 other people beneath you knowing about it. Therefore, you're making yourself subject to blackmail. You're risking your reputation. You're risking your family, your money, etc. That is likely to work, and you're telling him something that's true. So here we go. Charlie's saying, hey, you got this situation. You've got a client who wants to duck as many tax laws as you can. Option 1 is go in there and tell him he's stupid, tell him you won't work for him, tell him what he's doing is bad, all those other things. Or number 2, you can say, hey, if you do this, other people are going to know about that, and that's going to put you at risk of being at blackmail, and you're risking your reputation, your family, your money, etc. So 2 different approaches to the same problem. Back to what Charlie's saying. He says, do you want to spend a lot of time working for people where you have to use methods like that to get them to behave well? I think the answer is no. But if you're hooked with it, appealing to his interest is likely to work better as a matter of human persuasion than appealing to anything else. That, again, is the powerful psychological principle with deep biological roots. All right. So one of the things that Charlie mentions here a lot is this quote from Poor Richard's Almanack. He says, if you would, and that's Benjamin Franklin, sorry. If you would persuade, appeal to interest, not to reason, right? So that's what Charlie's talking about here. You've got this student, he asked a question about, hey, how can we add value to our profession? I think it's really interesting that Charlie starts by answering it in this way. Hey, how do you add value? He's essentially saying, hey, make sure you kind of study these models that I've talked about, that we talked about in the last podcast. And if you do that well, you can prevent really bad stuff from happening. That's exactly what he's talking about here. And he's saying, hey, how do you do that? You do that by persuading, by appealing to interest and not to reason. So that's kind of his fictional example. Now, after that, Charlie's going to follow that up with a real life example that actually happened. And the reference that he's going to have is actually talking about Salomon Brothers scandal in 1991, where the CEO was informed of violations. It was in April of 1991, I think, but essentially he waits to report them to regulators until August of 1991 after the scandal breaks publicly. It's super interesting. I went and watched some of the videos. Warren Buffett actually ends up going and testifying in Congress about it. Anyways, big scandal. So here we go. This is Charlie diving back into a real world example of what he's talking about here. I saw that psychological principle totally blown at Solomon. Solomon's general counsel knew that the CEO, John Gutfriend, should have promptly told the federal authorities all about Solomon's trading improprieties, in which Gutfriend didn't participate, in which he hadn't caused. So the CEO, he came in, he didn't participate in this scandal, and he hadn't caused it. And so this general counsel is trying to help Gutfriend make the correct next decision. Back to the book. The general counsel urged Gutfriend to do it. He told Gutfriend, in effect, you're probably not legally required to do that, but it's the right thing to do, and you really should. But it didn't work. The task was easy to put off because it was unpleasant. So that's what Gutfriend did. He put it off. So the general counsel tells the CEO, hey, you should probably report this to the federal authorities. But he kind of went about it in a soft way. He just said, hey, you're probably not legally required to do it, but it's the right thing to do. You should really do it. And the CEO ends up putting off the task because it's unpleasant. Back to the book. The general counsel had very little constituency with Solomon except for the CEO. If the CEO went down, the general counsel was going down with him. Therefore, his whole career was on the line. So to save his career, he needed to talk the CEO into doing the right thing. It would have been child's play to get the job done right. All the general counsel had to do was tell his boss, John, this situation could ruin your life. You could lose your wealth. You could lose your reputation. And that would have worked. CEOs don't like the idea of being ruined, disgraced, or fired. The ex-general counsel of Solomon is brilliant and generous, and he had the right idea. However, he lost his job because he didn't apply a little elementary psychology. He failed to recognize what works best in most cases is to appeal to a man's interest. But you don't have to get similarly lousy results when you face similar situations. Just remember what happened to Gutfriend and his general counsel. The right lessons are easily learned if you work at it. And if you do learn them, you can be especially useful at crucial moments when others fail. And to the extent you do become wise, diligent, objective, and especially able to persuade in a good cause, then you're adding value. All right. So like I said, I thought that was super interesting, especially putting it in the context of this is a young man asking Charlie, hey, how do I go about adding value, right? How can I add value? And the main point that Charlie hits on is the best way you can add value is use these principles I'm telling you about to prevent people from doing stupid things and not making elementary mistakes, right? If you can prevent elementary mistakes from happening, you are going to add value. And the number one thing he mentions is appealing to a man's interest and being able to persuade people to do the right thing by appealing to their interests. So I thought that was a great question. Super interesting to see the way that Charlie answers that question that the student proposed or put forth. So that was great. I love that. Now we're going to jump way forward in the book all the way to talk number 11. So talk number 11 is all about the psychology of human misjudgment. And this is something Charlie talks about a lot. And in it, he kind of explains what he means by the psychology of human misjudgment with an analogy. And so we're going to start with that analogy because I think it lays a really good foundation and understanding for what he means by that. Because I know when I read that phrase at first, I didn't quite understand what it meant. So here we go. This is Charlie talking. I will start my summary with a general observation that helps explain what follows. This observation is grounded in what we know about social insects. The limitations inherent in evolution's development of the nervous system cells that control behavior are beautifully demonstrated by these insects, which often have a mere 100,000 or so cells in their entire nervous systems, compared to man's multiple billions of cells in his brain alone. Each ant, like a human, is composed of a living physical structure, plus behavioral algorithms in its nerve cells. In the ant's case, the behavioral algorithms are few in number and almost entirely genetic in origin. The ants learn a little behavior from experiences, but mostly it merely responds to 10 or so stimuli with very few simple responses programmed into the nervous systems by its genes. Naturally, the simple ant behavior system has extreme limitations because of its limited nerve system repertoire. For instance, one type of ant, when it smells a pheromone given off by a dead ant's body in the hive, immediately responds by cooperating with other ants in carrying the dead body out of the hive. Harvard's great E.O. Wilson performed one of the best psychology experiments ever done when he painted dead ant pheromone on a live ant. Quite naturally, the other ants dragged this useful live ant out of the hive, even though it kicked and otherwise protested throughout the entire process. Such is the brain of the ant. It has a simple program of responses that generally work out all right, but which are imprudently used by rote in many cases. It seems obvious to me, at least, that the human brain must often operate counterproductively, just like the ants, from an unavoidable oversimplicity in its mental process, albeit usually in trying to solve some problems more difficult than those faced by ants that don't have to design airplanes. Man is easily fooled, either by a cleverly thought out manipulation of man, by circumstances occurring by accident, or by very effective manipulation practices that man has stumbled into during practice evolution and kept in place because they work so well. So essentially what he's saying here is the same way ants kind of have these predetermined responses that they're going to have to certain stimuli in certain situations, man kind of has the same thing. And one thing he says later on in the chapter is the tendencies are probably much more good than bad, otherwise they wouldn't be there. But essentially our default wiring is good for most things, but they can lead us to misjudgment, right? So we have this kind of default wiring in our brain that's going to cause us to behave in certain ways. Obviously, the ant example is oversimplified, but kind of reflects something similar in human psychology, right? We just have these default programs. Most of the time it's going to work out for good, but there's going to be situations where they lead us down the wrong path. And so that is what he's talking about when he says the psychology of human misjudgment, right? What are these kind of default programs that we have running that we need to make sure that we understand are going on so that we don't follow them when they lead us down a path that we shouldn't go. And so then the rest of the talk, he breaks down, it's over 20 of these misjudgment. We're going to dive into 4 of them today. So the first one he calls the incentive cause bias, diving into the book. I place this tendency first in my discussion because almost everyone thinks he fully recognizes how important incentives and disincentives are in changing cognition and behavior. But this is often not so. For instance, I think I've been in the top 5% of my age cohort almost all my adult life in understanding the power of incentives. Yet I've always underestimated that power. So he's saying, hey, I think I've always been one of the people who understands how important incentives are. I think I've been the top 5% of those people, and I've always underestimated the power. Every year I see examples that show me that I still have underestimated that power. He says, never a year passes, but I get some surprise that pushes me a little further in my appreciation of incentive superpower. All right, and now he's going to give us an example of what this looks like in real life. One of my favorite cases about the power of incentives is the Federal Express case. The integrity of the Federal Express system requires that all packages be shifted rapidly among airplanes in one central airport each night. The system has no integrity for the customers if the night work shift can't accomplish its assignment fast. And Federal Express had one hell of a time getting the night shift to do the right thing. They tried moral persuasion. They tried everything in the world without luck. And finally, somebody got the happy thought that it was foolish to pay the night shift by the hour when what the employer wanted was not maximized billable hours of employee service, but fault-free, rapid performance of a particular task. Maybe, this person thought, if they paid the employees per shift and let all the night shift employees go home when all the planes were loaded, the system would work better. And lo and behold, that solution worked. So I love that example. Yeah, it's talking about FedEx. It's crazy. I actually remember watching a documentary in college with my roommate about FedEx's overnight shipping. And it's crazy to, even if it's just in the middle of a winter storm, you'll see, if you're like, oh, they had a camera from the runway, and if you're looking up from the runway, you could see a line of like 5 or 6 planes with their lights on coming in and landing. It's insane how FedEx is able to do that. But that's a great example of, hey, they had this problem. These employees needed to be finishing all this work in the night shift. And hey, instead of paying them per hour, pay them to get the job done, right? That's a great example. Back to what Charlie was saying, skipping ahead a little bit in the book here. Charlie says, we should also heed the general lesson implicit in the injunction of Ben Franklin in Poor Richard's Almanack. If you would persuade, appeal to interest and not to reason, right? We heard this before. We were just talking about this. This maxim is a wise guide to a great and simple precaution in life. Never, ever think about something else when you should be thinking about the power of incentives. I'm going to say that again. Never, ever think about something else when you should be thinking about the power of incentives. I once saw he kind of calls back to the example from talk number 3 that we just referenced. I once saw a very smart house counsel for a major investment bank lose his job with no moral fault because he ignored the lesson in this maxim of Franklin. The counsel failed to persuade his client because he told him his moral duty as correctly conceived by the counsel without also telling the client in vivid terms that he was very likely to be clobbered to smithereens if he didn't behave as his counsel recommended. And as a result, both the client and the counsel lost their careers. So just a great way to finish that off. I'm actually going to pull in the other book, All I Want to Know Is Where I'm Going to Die, so I never go there. Munger gives another great example of a story about incentives that I did a little more research in, and it looks like it's a true story. There is even a book written about it, but it's a crazy story about the power of incentives. So I wanted to add that one here as well. Munger, I can give an example that surprised me. I'm used to doctors who think a procedure that's good for them is good for you. They're wrong. But in Redding, California, a couple of doctors rose who gave everybody who consulted them open heart surgery. They convinced themselves that everybody needed open heart surgery. A normal heart was a widowmaker. If you replaced it with carbon or nylon or something, they were way better off. They did massive amounts of open heart surgeries. They had the feeling they were doing the right thing and really helping patients. That surprised me. I'm always being surprised by something like that. It seems impossible. How could anybody behave that way? How could it go on for year after year? It's incentive caused bias. They were making money and status, and they were demonstrating skills and so forth. It's so extreme. You'd think that it couldn't happen. If it did happen, you'd think it would be identified by other people early, and this ran on for years. So yeah, this was a crazy story. I looked it up. It looks like it happened in the late 1990s and early 2000s, where these doctors were performing all of these open heart surgeries that didn't need to occur, and they were making something like $300,000 per surgery, or the hospital was. I don't know what it looks like there was a lawsuit. I'm not sure where it ended up, but just a crazy story about the effects of incentives, right? These effects led to doctors performing a bunch of surgeries, open heart surgeries on patients that didn't need them because the incentives were there for them to feel that way. It's just crazy. Like I said, I looked it up. There's a book called Coronary, A True Story of Medicine Gone Awry. So that may be a super interesting story I need to check out a little bit more. So that was number 1, incentive cause tendency. On to the next one. This is number 5 in his book. He calls it the inconsistency avoidance tendency. And essentially, this kind of sums it up. People avoid being inconsistent. Here we go. Charlie says, few people demonstrated this process better than Ben Franklin. As he was rising from obscurity in Philadelphia and wanted the approval of some important man, Franklin would often maneuver that man into doing Franklin some unimportant favor, like lending Franklin a book. Thereafter, the man would admire and trust Franklin more because a non-admired and non-trusted Franklin would be inconsistent with the appraisal implicit in lending Franklin the book. That was super interesting, and I think an extremely practical example, right? He lays out this example where Franklin is using this inconsistency avoidance tendency to get on people's good side. If Ben could get them to do him a minor favor, it would end up making them like him and trust him. And so the way he would do this is by trying to get something unimportant favor from that person, such as lending them a book. I thought that was super interesting. All right, jumping on to number 9. This is what Munger calls the reciprocation tendency. And it's pretty much the automatic tendency of humans to reciprocate both good favors and disfavors. So Charlie says, suppose you are the purchasing agent of someone else, a rich employer, for instance. Now, the minor favor you receive from the salesman is less opposed by the threat of extra cost to you because someone else is paying for the extra cost. So essentially what he's talking about here is, if you have someone who's selling something and they're taking you out or they're giving you gifts, you have a tendency to reciprocate the good favors to them. In this case, it would be buying something for more than it costs because they're giving you favors, right? And so now he's laying out this example where, okay, you're actually the purchasing agent for somebody else. So it's not the money coming out of your pocket. So maybe you have a salesman who's selling you something, but the actual money that's getting spent isn't coming out of your pocket, all right? So he says, wise employers therefore try to oppose the reciprocate favor tendencies of employees engaged in purchasing. This simple antidote works best. Don't let them accept any favors from vendors. Sam Walton, the guy who started Walmart, agreed with this idea of absolute prohibition. He wouldn't let purchasing agents accept so much as a hot dog from a vendor. Given the subconscious level at which much reciprocation tendency operates, this policy of Walton's was profoundly correct. If I controlled the Defense Department, its policies would mimic Walton's. And now he kind of dives in to an experiment that's showing this tendency. He says, in a famous psychological experiment, Cialdini brilliantly demonstrated the power of compliance practitioners to mislead people by triggering their subconscious reciprocation tendency. Carrying out this experiment, Cialdini caused his compliance practitioners to wander around his campus and ask strangers to supervise a bunch of juvenile delinquents on a trip to the zoo. Because this happened on a campus, one person in 6 out of a large sample actually agreed to do this. After accumulating this 1 in 6 statistic, Cialdini changed his procedure. His practitioners next wandered around the campus, asking strangers to devote a big chunk of time every week for 2 years to supervise juvenile delinquents. This ridiculous request got him a 100% rejection rate. But the practitioner had a follow-up question. Will you at least spend one afternoon taking juvenile delinquents to a zoo? This raised Cialdini's former acceptance rate of 1 in 6 to 1 in 2, a tripling. What Cialdini's compliance practitioners had done was make a small concession, which was reciprocated by a small concession from the other side. This subconscious reciprocation of concession by Cialdini's experimental subjects actually caused a much increased percentage of them to end up irrationally agreeing to go to a zoo with juvenile delinquents. So yeah, that was a super interesting example and experiment that he laid out. And like I said, I'm grabbing these because I think they're really practical in what we can do in our day-to-day, right? So he's showing us here, hey, here's this reciprocation tendency. Here's how it can go right. Here's how it works. And if you have someone who's giving you concessions, you are more likely to give concessions back to them. And that's our default wiring. And you need to watch out for that because there's really interesting results that can come up from it. And like you mentioned earlier, you can get manipulated from it. Humans can manipulate other humans by using these tactics. The same way this experiment shows how Cialdini took it from 1 in 6 students agreeing to take juveniles to the zoo, and he tripled that rate to 1 in 2 by just framing it differently, and then by giving a concession after the initial ask. I just thought that was super interesting. That was an experiment I hadn't heard about before. All right, number 14, last one we're going to cover today, the deprival superreaction tendency. And the way he describes this is the quantity of man's pleasure from a $10 gain does not exactly match the quantity of his displeasure from a $10 loss. So this is something I kind of heard before. Hey, people are more hesitant to lose money than they are optimistic about gaining it. Back to Charlie talking. He says, I myself, many decades ago, made a big mistake caused in part by the subconscious operation of my deprival superreaction tendency. A friendly broker called and offered me 300 shares of a ridiculously underpriced, very thinly traded Belridge oil at $115 per share, which I purchased using cash I had on hand. The next day he offered me 1,500, which was 5 times more, shares at the same price, which I declined to buy, partly because I could only have made the purchase had I sold something or borrowed the required $173,000. This was a very irrational decision. I was a well-to-do man with no debt. There was no risk of loss, and similar no-risk opportunities were not likely to come along. Within 2 years, Belridge Oil sold out to Shell at a price of about $3,700 per share. That's 32 times higher, right? So initially bought it for $115. They sold 2 years later for $3,700 per share, which made me about $5.4 million poorer than I would have been had I been psychologically acute. As this tale demonstrates, psychological ignorance can be very expensive. So I Googled this story. It looks like it happened in 1979. It was Shell actually bought Belridge Oil Company, and they bought them for $3.65 billion. And that was the largest corporate acquisition in U.S. history at the time. So this was a crazy story. And I also like this story because, especially as I've been listening to David Sinra's Founders podcast and learning more about Charlie, one of the things that he and Warren talk about over and over and over again is, hey, they just make a few really good bets. They have that kind of 20 punch ticket analogy where Warren Buffett tells students, hey, if I could do anything to help you in your career, it would be to give you a punch card with 20 punches, and you only get to have 20 investments in your entire career, because essentially he's saying you would think more about each one if you had that frame of mind. And this is something that they just talk about all the time is, hey, once you're not going to find great opportunities often, but once you do, you've got to go all in. And I think this story is kind of early on in Charlie's career with Berkshire. And just as I was reading it, I was thinking, hey, this must have been one of those cases that really taught Charlie, hey, when you find a good opportunity, go all in, because they don't come around that often. Right, I reference back to talk number 2, where Charlie says, it's not given to human beings to have such talent that they can just know everything about everything all the time. But it is given to human beings who work hard at it, who look and sift the world for a mispriced bet that they can occasionally find one. And the wise ones bet heavily when the world offers them that opportunity. They bet big when they have the odds, and the rest of the time they don't. It's just that simple. And like I said, this story about Belridge Oil Company, I feel like is probably one of those stories from Charlie's career that really helps sink in this learning lesson for him. And it's what he's trying to pass on to us through his book, and the lessons that he's just trying to pass on as he talks to his students is, hey, look, here's a mistake I made. I got offered this ridiculously underpriced stock that I knew did not have much downside. I was scared to lose or scared to have to take out debt to be able to buy more shares, even though I knew it was the right thing to do. And I didn't do it, and I ended up being $5.4 million poorer than I would have been had I done that. So anyways, that's where we're going to close out today's podcast and this series on Charlie Munger. It's been such a blast studying Charlie Munger through this book, Poor Charlie's Almanack. Also, this book, All I Want to Know Is Where I'm Going to Die, so that I don't go there. I'm sure I'll do another podcast on this book in the future, because it's also got a bunch of great stuff in there. But like I said, a few of my kind of primary takeaways from this entire series is number 1, invert, always invert. Charlie talks about that a lot. When you're trying to figure out what to do, it's really good frame to just think about, hey, what should you not do? One of the phrases that's really stuck with me is how little originality there is in the common disasters of mankind, right? So that's another thing he talks about. Learn from other people and learn from your own mistakes, right? So learn vicariously through other people, learn from your own mistakes, and try not to make the same mistakes over and over again. Never ever think about something else when you should be thinking about the power of incentives. We talked about that today. We talked about how even Charlie says, hey, I think I've understood incentives better than most people, and yet every year I'm still underestimating the power of incentives. Your reputation is everything. That was a huge thing. I didn't touch as much on that in these podcasts, but it is something that David Sinra focuses a lot on in his Founders podcast. We did go over the story about Salomon Brothers, though, and that was really one of the big moments where Warren Buffett really emphasizes how important your reputation is, and your reputation is everything. And then lastly, I love this. It ties into the incentive structure that Charlie Munger talks about, but the fundamental algorithm of life is repeat what works. Find what works and do more of that. Charlie uses that both personally on, hey, finding things that don't work and don't do those things. Find the things that work for you. and do more of those things. I think it's a great algorithm to think of, and it just ties into, once you hear that and you listen and study Charlie, you just see it everywhere. One of the things that's coming to my mind right now is how they talk about, hey, we just hire people and we buy companies and hire people that are working and have worked and we believe will continue to work. Find things that work and just repeat what works. So with that, I'm going to close out here. Appreciate you guys listening, and I'll catch you next time.